You tweet and talk about a lot of. It's not really controversial. It wasn't controversial a couple of years ago, right? I'm looking at the American culture just like you are from outside perspective, right? You can see the madness clearly. What's going on? It's just absolutely crazy, especially with the woke culture. And I have my own theory about this. And I think you are pushing it back as much as you can with the transgenderism and so on. How do you think this all started, and where do you think this is going, to be honest?
Wow. I mean, if you really want to get to the roots of it, this has roots back many, many decades. But what happened is that in the early to mid 2010s, it went into hyperdrive and it all got mainstreamed. So a lot of the ideas that make up woke ideology, the various forms of critical theory, critical race theory, critical gender theory, transgender ideology, all of these things. Obviously, I don't know, Marxism goes back further. Postmodernism. These ideas go back, many decades. Someone could trace them back centuries, but really came into their form in the early to mid 1900s in many ways. But they were always in the margins of academia, of some of the social sciences, some of the liberal arts colleges, things like that, where there were, genders theory and women's studies.
It was a shadow part of the society, wasn't it?
Yes, it was stuff that it wasn't mainstream.
It wasn't mainstream.
It's been bubbling below the surface for a long time. And many of the architects of these ideas are no longer alive, right? These are philosophers and thinkers from, if you look at the Frankfurt School and things like that. That's really where it's rooted. But what happened is in the 2010s, it went mainstream through, I think, perhaps a convergence of a lot of different things that had happened and a lot of things that were going on. It really depends on how deep you want to go with it. This is a topic that I think actually has, the way it's taken hold in many parts of the West, I think has very deep religious, philosophical, and human roots, right? I see this as something that is acting as a substitute religion.
That makes sense. It's
right?
a cult.
Yes, it's so.
Because if you cannot speak against or raise your opinion and have a fruitful debate, it becomes a cult.
Yes.
If you cannot debate the idea, it's a cult.
Yes.
Right? At least peacefully.
Yeah. So in the West, there's been a decline in religiosity. There's been a decline in Christian and overall religious adherence. And I've thought about this a lot, and something that seems obvious to me is that human beings, I've said this phrase many times, I believe that human beings are essentially a religious creature, right?
Yep.
Human beings are religious. Does this mean that every single person in the world has a clear religiosity or whatever? But no, right? Even someone who purely believes in secularism and evolution and just hard science, it's clear, even if that's your belief system, it's still clear that human beings have evolved to have religious proclivities, right? All around the world. Look at any nation, any culture, look through human history.
They've always looked up to a higher power.
Yes,
right? Drawings about it, yes. Always.
Absolutely. So it's taken many different forms, many different names. You've had polytheism, you've had monotheism, and all its different flavors, all the different denominations of all the different religions. But it's clear, I think about 90% of the globe's population right now in 2023 believes in God. Right? Yep. Something like that. It's certainly over 80%. So it's within people. And I think some people call this the substitution hypothesis, which is that if that is taken out of an individual or a society, it's going to be replaced with something, right? Correct. Nature abhors a vacuum. Correct. And what's essentially happening in many parts of the Anglosphere especially is that this wokeness, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, the obsession with race, gender, transgenderism, LGBTQ, AIAPX2S, like whatever it is at this
3,
point.
4, 5, 6,
yeah, it's essentially functioning as it's replacing the values and the morals and the things that people care about, the thing that is holy, the thing that you cannot criticize.
The moral grounding.
Literally the flag that you fly.
Correct.
Right? This month, I mean, if you look at Regent Street in the UK, in London, I mean, they literally replaced all the British flags with pride flags.
Crazy.
Not even the normal pride flag, like the crazy one that's got the intersectional, the trans flag in there and all these other things in it. And that's so symbolic. Like if you think of what you're doing, right? Like the national flag actually already represents all British people, right? The American flag represents all Americans. It doesn't matter your race, your gender, your sexuality, whatever. And they're just like, no, we're dedicating an entire month to this whole thing. And then you've got what's being pushed in the schools, what's being pushed on kids. Every institution is getting parasitized by this basket of ideas. So I think the roots of it are actually very, very deep. I don't think it's just some superficial thing. Of course, you have got the economic incentives towards it. You have got the corporate equity index and things like ESG scores, which is one reason why it's kind of woke capitalism. It's being pushed by the corporations and so on. But I'll tell you what I do think as well is I also do think that I think we've passed peak woke.
You think?
Yes, and I don't mean we've passed the peak of the ridiculousness of it all, but people's tolerance of it is very rapidly declining. As I said earlier, 2016, 2017, apart from a handful of people, very few people were even talking about this or were even noticing.
Because it wasn't that on your face.
It wasn't. No, it wasn't at that time, right? But the harder, they've taken it to such an insane level, pushing it on people's children, right? Trying to put it in the schools, just hammering people all day, every day with it. All these companies, all these governments just doing all this ridiculous stuff nonstop. It's almost become like a parody. It's gotten so ridiculous. Look, by the time you're allowing big men like us with beards to say that we are women and go in and start cleaning up in women's sports, like you've jumped, you right? It's absurd. It's like South Park, right? It's so silly. It's just like, come on. This shouldn't even be political. I don't care if you're a liberal, progressive, conservative, whatever. Surely we can acknowledge this is silly. This is ridiculous. This is goofy. This
just because
is not,
you took some what is that testosterone replacement, the opposite way, reverse.
You don't even have to do that though. You don't even have to go that far. That's what I mean. Like you can literally just say self-identity, right? It's called self-ID, right? You can literally just say. You don't need to do anything. You can just come out tomorrow and say, "Hey, I'm I feel like and no one is meant to even ask a question. Everyone's just supposed to go, "Oh, okay."
There was a hearing I don't know where it was, some sort of U.S. hearing. Then the guy asked a boxing committee. I think it was in Vegas or something. He was the one who runs it. And the guy said, "Okay, so men can identify as women and fight." Yeah, if that's how the guy feels, fine. Okay, what if Mike Tyson tomorrow felt like he's a woman and will you allow him to fight? And he's like, if that's what he feels. You can 54, 55-year-old Mike Tyson will clean up 19-year-olds right now.
I'd watch. Michelle Tyson. Let's go. This is why it can't stand though.
Yeah.
Right? So you can get away with a big lie for a certain amount of time, but not forever. Sure. Right. It comes to a point where the rubber meets the road, and that's happening on multiple levels, right? Because it's actually impacting people.
It is.
Right.
It is.
If you have a daughter in school and she now has to compete against a man, or she's got men in her changing room. Yeah. If your children are being targeted with this ideology, and your son is coming home telling you that maybe he's a girl, or your daughter's coming home saying her teacher said that she can, at that point, the tolerance runs out. Yep. At that point,
you cross the line.
Yeah, you've crossed certain lines, and people are like, "Look, we tried to be accommodating. We tried to, we didn't really understand this thing or whatever. But now the threat is very clear, right? The hormones they're doing, the surgeries they're doing, like the harms are becoming very clear. People who even went through this process and regret it are speaking up and speaking out. So a lot has changed in just the last 4 or 5 years." So when I say that I think we've reached the peak of the wokeness, I don't mean that all of a sudden it's going to stop, but there's an increasing pushback. And some of these companies that are pushing it, like they're getting hit in the pocket as well. Whether you're talking about Disney, you're talking about, I don't know if you saw the whole thing with Target, the Anheuser-Busch situation with the Bud Light. Like these are very clear signs that, okay, you've annoyed enough people now. You've annoyed enough people. Like you're losing mainstream support. You're losing money, which is the thing corporations care about. Yeah. There's going to be politicians who push this stuff who are going to start getting voted out or whatever. So it is going to be forced to come back more towards a state of normalcy. And also people are just tired. People do get exhausted of being constantly beaten over the head with any type of ideology, but especially something that's so incoherent, right? It's something that you know it doesn't make sense. You know it's not truthful. You can see the impact it's having. So I'm actually pretty hopeful in that regard. I'm fairly optimistic, and my predictions about the future tend to be pretty good because I'm remarkably close to a lot of these issues in a way that most people aren't. I'm just connected to so many people all around the world of all different stripes. So you could get to kind of see the future because you're talking to people who this is really impacting. Like I've had so many messages from parents whose children are being, going through this stuff. And so I'm just sitting there and I'm like learning and I'm seeing, and I've been in the, I've been a public voice on some of these things for several years at this point. And I can see a massive difference between when I posted that tweet in 2019, when people were like, oh, this isn't really happening, this isn't a problem, to now where you've got whole movements of people who are like, okay, this is a problem. And the more that people speak up, the more it emboldens other people too, right? So if only a few people are talking about something and there can be consequences for talking about it or whatever, then most people stay hushed. Even if they privately are like, this, I don't agree with this thing or it doesn't make sense, most people will stay quiet. But the more people speak up and say, okay, enough, like let's stop that, other people feel emboldened because they know they're not alone to go out there and say, okay, yeah, you're right. Like this is enough. This has gone much further than I thought it would.